The stage lights blazed down on the packed auditorium as Jonathan Roumie, the 42-year-old acclaimed actor, stood confidently at the podium. His poised demeanor and calm presence filled the space, his deep voice cutting through the air with a touch of sincerity and authority. The crowd of over 2,000 people filled every seat, with hundreds more watching from overflow room. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave the Hollywood icon Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson completely speechless. Across from him sat Dwayne Johnson, the larger-than-life former wrestler and actor, his muscular build and booming voice commanding attention. At 51, Dwayne looked confident, but there was something in his posture, the way he carried himself with the pride of a man who had built his empire, that suggested he wasn't prepared for what was coming next. The audience had no idea they were about to witness an extraordinary clash of philosophies. The event had been billed as a conversation about success in America, bringing together voices from different generations and backgrounds. Political insiders had been buzzing about it for weeks. Dwayne's team was confident this would be another opportunity to showcase his trademark charisma and immigrant success story. They had no idea what was about to unfold. "You think you can lecture us about America?" Dwayne had just thundered, his voice echoing off the auditorium walls, pointing directly at Jonathan with the same commanding presence that had dominated movie screens for decades. "I built my success from nothing, and now I see what's wrong with this country." The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't how these events usually went. The carefully planned discussion about American opportunity was already veering into confrontational territory, and they were only 15 minutes in. But Jonathan's response, delivered with the precision of a calm and deliberate actor and the confidence of someone who had spent his career speaking truth with grace, would not only silence the action hero, but send shockwaves through social media within minutes. This wasn't just a debate. This was about to become the moment that changed everything. The tension in the room was electric. Phones were already being pulled out discreetly, sensing that something historic was about to unfold. Dwayne thought he was facing just another politician who would wilt under his star power and commanding presence. He had no idea he was about to meet his match in the most unexpected way possible. Dwayne Johnson stood on that stage carrying decades of American success on his shoulders. From wrestling champion to Hollywood's biggest action star, from the Fast and Furious franchise to becoming a global business mogul, this was a man who had conquered every arena he'd entered. At 51, his physical presence still commanded respect. His history still loomed large. But tonight was different. Tonight, Dwayne wasn't just the beloved action star or the successful business mogul. Tonight, he was a man with strong opinions about the direction of America, and he wasn't holding back. His recent comments about younger politicians had stirred controversy, with many saying he was out of touch with modern America. Dwayne believed his immigrant success story gave him the right to speak truth to power. After all, he'd come to America with dreams and a desire to change the world. He had built an empire from hard work and perseverance. In his mind, he had earned the right to critique anyone, especially politicians, who he saw as all talk and no substance. His confidence was unshakable, built on decades of overcoming every challenge thrown his way. The wrestling world had told him he was too big, too brash, too different. He proved them wrong. Hollywood had said his name was too hard to pronounce, that he was too rough. He became one of the highest paid actors in the world. Politics seemed impossible for a former wrestler, but here he was, dominating on every front. In Dwayne's mind, there was no obstacle that couldn't be overcome with enough determination and hard work. Tonight, he planned to share that message with America once again, especially targeting what he saw as a generation of politicians who made excuses instead of results. Across from him stood Jonathan Roumie, and he was everything Dwayne didn't expect. At 42, Jonathan represented a new generation of thought leaders. Calm, composed, and completely unimpressed by celebrity status, the actor, known for his roles that often carried deeper philosophical and spiritual meaning, had already made waves with his thought-provoking speeches. His reputation as a man of integrity and wisdom had preceded him. Colleagues and fans spoke of his ability to dismantle opposing arguments with deep understanding and respect, while his critics found it hard to argue with the authenticity in his message. Jonathan wasn't just another actor. He was a man who had spent years reflecting on the deeper meaning of success, using his platform not just for entertainment, but for social good. His background was starkly different from Dwayne's, a man of Hollywood glamour. While Dwayne had built his empire through physicality and charisma, Jonathan had focused on the spiritual and intellectual dimensions of human success. His upbringing had not been shaped by the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, but by a commitment to personal growth and social justice. Where Dwayne fought for victory in the ring and on screen, Jonathan fought for meaning and understanding in the real world. His preparation for this moment had been meticulous. He'd studied Dwayne's career, his speeches, his public persona. He understood Dwayne's worldview, his strengths, and most importantly, his blind spots. Where Dwayne saw his story as the model for success, Jonathan saw the pieces Dwayne had overlooked, the barriers that others, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, had to face in order to succeed. What made this confrontation so explosive was the generational and philosophical divide it represented. Here was the immigrant success story facing off against the man who believed in a more inclusive, thoughtful approach to understanding America's future. The icon who built his career on grit and action was up against the intellectual who sought to teach through understanding. Two completely different versions of the American experience were about to collide on live television. This wasn't just about two people disagreeing. This was about fundamental questions facing America. Who gets to define success? Who has the right to critique? And what happens when old school thinking meets new school reality? The broader context made this confrontation even more significant. It was happening at a time when America was grappling with questions about equality, opportunity, and whether the traditional pathways to success were truly available to everyone. The audience represented this divide perfectly. In one section sat older, predominantly white Americans who saw Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as a symbol of what was possible in America, proof that anyone could make it with enough drive. In another section were younger, more diverse Americans who admired Jonathan Roumie's fight for justice and equality. Between them were the undecideds, people who respected both figures but weren't sure whose vision of America they believed in more. The stakes extended far beyond this single event. Political strategists from both parties were watching closely, understanding that this confrontation could influence how Americans talked about success, merit, and opportunity for years to come. Social media algorithms were already primed to amplify whatever happened, meaning this conversation would reach millions of people within hours. The audience knew they were witnessing something special. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation, with hashtags starting to trend before the real confrontation had even begun. Political insiders were watching closely, understanding that moments like these could shift entire narratives and launch or destroy political careers. Dwayne Johnson had walked onto that stage, confident in his legacy and his right to speak his mind. Jonathan Roumie had prepared for this moment his entire career. Every film, every public appearance, every challenge had led to this. Neither was backing down, neither was planning to lose. The stage was set for a clash that would be talked about for years to come. The moderator had barely finished introducing the topic when Dwayne leaned into his microphone, his famous voice filling every corner of the auditorium. His muscular hands gripped the edges of the podium as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be a knockout punch. "Let me tell you something," and he began, his voice thick with confidence and charisma. "I came to America with sewn in my pocket, $7, and I built an empire." The audience stirred, some nodding in approval, others shifting in their seats with anticipation. Dwayne was in his element, telling the story he'd told 1,000 times before, on film, in interviews, at motivational rallies. But tonight there was an edge to it, a challenge directed squarely at the man sitting across from him. His eyes never left Jonathan as he spoke, clearly expecting to see some sign of intimidation or deference. He found neither. Dwayne's confidence radiated from every pore. This was his moment, his stage, his story to tell. He'd used this narrative to win over fans, voters, and countless audiences worldwide. In his mind, it was irrefutable proof of the American dream and personal determination. "I didn't complain about the system," Dwayne continued, his voice rising. "I didn't blame others for my problems. I worked harder than anyone else. I lifted weights when others slept. I studied when others partied. I chased the American dream, and I caught it." Applause rippled through parts of the crowd, but Jonathan sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his hands folded calmly in his lap. Dwayne wasn't finished. His confidence was building with each word. "And now I look at Hollywood, and what do I see? People who've never taken a real risk, never fought for anything in their lives, telling the rest of us how to live ours." Dwayne's gaze locked onto Jonathan, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. You could feel the tension building like electricity before a storm. The moderator instinctively leaned back in his chair, sensing that his carefully planned discussion was about to go completely off script. Camera operators adjusted their angles, zooming in to capture every micro-expression. The professional lighting cast dramatic shadows across both faces, making this feel less like a political discussion and more like a championship boxing match. "Mr. Roumie," Dwayne said, his voice lowering, as the intensity from his action movie roles slipped into his delivery. "With all due respect, what have you actually built? What roles have you created? How many people have you inspired to change their lives?" The question hung in the air like a challenge loaded with decades of American mythology about achievement and success. Some audience members leaned forward in their seats. Others shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of confrontation everyone had come to see. But now that it was happening, the tension was almost unbearable. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, as everyone waited to see how Jonathan would handle this direct assault on his credentials. Dwayne's body language exuded complete confidence. He clearly expected this question to end the debate before it really began. After all, what actor could match his record of business success and cultural impact? His slight smile suggested he believed he had just delivered a decisive blow. But Jonathan's response was immediate and calm. "Mr. Johnson, I've built something you can't buy with all your fame and fortune. Trust with the people I represent." Dwayne wasn't backing down. If anything, her response seemed to fuel his fire. "Trust?" Dwayne laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Trust doesn't create success. Trust doesn't change the world. Hard work does, and I've got the results to prove it." He stood up from his chair, his massive frame casting a shadow across the stage. The action movie star was coming out, the man who'd never lost a fight on screen and rarely lost one in real life. "I was the first to make it in a field that no one thought a wrestler could break into," Dwayne declared, his voice booming. "I made millions. I turned a franchise into a global phenomenon. I didn't just play the game, I rewrote it." The audience was split now. Some were cheering Dwayne's display of force. Others were watching Jonathan carefully, waiting to see how he would respond to this verbal assault. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up to match Dwayne's imposing presence. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his voice cutting through the noise with surgical precision. "Mr. Johnson," Jonathan began, his calm demeanor never faltering, "you're absolutely right about one thing. Results do matter. But let's talk about what really defines success." Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his voice cutting through Dwayne Johnson's bluster with surgical precision. "Mr. Johnson, you're absolutely right about one thing," he said, his tone so calm it was almost unsettling. "Results matter, so let's talk about results." Dwayne's confident smile faltered just slightly. Something in Jonathan's tone, something in the way he said those words made him pause. "You built a career in Hollywood, dominated the wrestling ring, and became a global icon," Jonathan continued, his voice still eerily calm. "You made tough decisions, just as you said, but I wonder, do you ever think about the people those tough decisions affected?" Dwayne's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned about his record, especially not by someone he clearly viewed as his junior in both age and experience. "I made the decisions that needed to be made," Dwayne shot back, his voice thickening with frustration. "Sometimes leadership means making unpopular choices. That's what real leaders do." "Real leaders," Jonathan repeated softly as if he were tasting the words. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson, when you were making those real leadership decisions, did you ever have to choose between paying for your child's medication or paying rent?" The question hit the room like a thunderbolt. You could feel the shift in energy, the way the audience suddenly became more focused, more attentive. Dwayne's face tightened. "That's not the point," he muttered. "Did you ever have to work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table?" Jonathan continued, his voice still calm, but now carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Did you ever have to explain to your children why they couldn't have new shoes for school?" Dwayne was getting visibly agitated now. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. He'd expected to overwhelm Jonathan with his credentials, his success story, his larger-than-life presence. Instead, Jonathan was systematically dismantling his position with questions that seemed to come from a completely different universe than the one Dwayne lived in. "Look," Dwayne said, his voice rising again, "I understand that people struggle, but the answer isn't more government handouts. The answer is what I did. Work harder, dream bigger, never give up." The crowd was completely silent now. Everyone could feel that something big was coming. Jonathan sat there for a moment, letting Dwayne's words hang in the air, letting the full weight of what he just said settle over the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but in the silence of the auditorium, every word carried like thunder. "Mr. Johnson," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something that made even Dwayne lean in slightly to hear what came next. "I have a question for you." The auditorium fell into complete silence. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the rustle of papers, even the sound of people breathing. Dwayne Johnson, the man who had faced down movie monsters and political opponents alike, stood waiting for whatever Jonathan Roumie was about to say. Jonathan rose slowly from his chair, not dramatically, not to match Dwayne's earlier display of physical presence, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was about to do. His voice, when he finally spoke, was crystal clear and carried to every corner of the packed room. "Mr. Johnson," Jonathan began, his words measured, "you keep talking about working harder, dreaming bigger, never giving up, and I respect that journey. I truly do. Coming to America and building what you've built is remarkable." Dwayne's expression softened slightly. For a moment, it seemed like maybe this was going to be a moment of mutual respect, of finding common ground. Jonathan continued, his tone still respectful, but with an edge that suggested he wasn't finished. "But I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer." He paused, letting the tension build naturally. Dwayne shifted on his feet, suddenly looking less confident than he had moments before. "When you came to America, did you have to worry about being shot by police during a traffic stop because of the color of your skin?" The question hit the room like a physical force. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the audience. Dwayne's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jonathan wasn't finished. "When you were building your wrestling career, did casting directors tell you that you looked too threatening for leading roles? When you walked into banks to get business loans, did they assume you were there to rob the place instead of invest in it?" Dwayne's face was changing now, the color draining from his cheeks as the full impact of Jonathan's words began to sink in. "When you were acting, did you ever have to explain to your children how to avoid harm in a world where people saw them as threats because of their race?" The audience erupted. Some people were on their feet applauding. Others were stunned into silence. But all eyes were on Dwayne, who stood frozen at his podium, his mouth still slightly open, clearly struggling to process what he just heard. Jonathan raised his hand and somehow, impossibly, the room began to quiet down. He wasn't done. "You see, Mr. Johnson," Jonathan continued, stepping closer to the mic, his voice unwavering, "you and I both believe in hard work. We both believe in the American dream, but we've been playing by completely different rules. And it's time someone said that out loud." Dwayne tried to respond, his voice coming out rougher than usual. I never said that everyone's journey was the same." "No," Jonathan interrupted, and his voice carried such authority that Dwayne actually stopped mid-sentence. "You didn't say it, but you implied it every time you suggested that success is just about working harder. Every time you questioned what people like me have built, without acknowledging the barriers we've had to overcome just to get in the room." Jonathan stepped closer to his microphone, his voice becoming more impassioned, but never losing its precision. "You want to know what I've built, Mr. Johnson? I've built a career in a system that wasn't designed for people who look like me. I've built trust with communities that have been failed by that system for generations. I've built bridges between worlds that people like you don't even know exist." Dwayne was now visibly struggling. The confident movie star, the successful businessman, the former wrestler, all of that seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a man who was clearly out of his depth. Jonathan looked directly at Dwayne, his gaze steady and unwavering. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute truth. "Mr. Johnson," Jonathan said, "you came to America and became the people's champion. But the difference between us is that I came into this world already having to fight for the chance to belong here." The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before applause, but the kind that comes when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something historic. Dwayne stood at his podium, frozen, unable to respond. "But the difference between us is that I came into this world already having to terminate the assumption that I didn't belong here." The room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes before applause, but the kind that comes when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something historic, something that will be talked about and remembered for years to come. Dwayne Johnson stood at his podium, And for the first time in perhaps his entire public life, the man who had always had an answer, who had always projected absolute confidence, looked completely and utterly speechless. His mouth moved as if he was trying to form words, but nothing came out. His hands, which had been gesturing confidently throughout the evening, hung limply at his sides. The man who had portrayed the unstoppable champion now looked like his circuits had just been completely fried. The audience's reaction was unlike anything anyone had ever seen at a political event. Some people were crying, others were standing and applauding so loudly it sounded like thunder. Still others sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A woman in the front row was overheard saying to her companion, "I've never heard anyone explain it like that before." A middle-aged man was shaking his head, saying, "I never thought about it that way." But the most telling reaction came from Dwayne himself. As the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, as he realized that his entire worldview had just been challenged in a way he had never experienced before, his expression changed from confusion to something that looked almost like recognition. When Dwayne finally managed to speak, his voice was barely above a whisper. I never meant to imply." He stopped, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look years older than when the evening had started. "Mr. Roumie," he said finally, his voice now sounding strained and uncertain. I think I need to think about what you just said." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an admission of defeat, but coming from Dwayne Johnson, the man who had built his entire career on never backing down, never showing weakness, it was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said in public. What had just happened went far beyond a simple political debate. This was a moment when two completely different American experiences had collided, when privilege had been forced to confront perspective, when success had been redefined in real time. Jonathan Roumie had done something that millions of people had been trying to do for years. He had found a way to explain the concept of systemic barriers and different starting points in a way that even someone as successful and confident as Dwayne Johnson couldn't dismiss or ignore. The moderator, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. I think we all need a moment to process what just happened here." But the damage, or perhaps the enlightenment, was already done. Dwayne Johnson, the people's champion himself, had been terminated, not by weapons or violence, but by truth delivered with surgical precision by a man who had spent his entire life learning how to fight battles Dwayne never even knew existed. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, the clip was everywhere. The exchange between Dwayne and Jonathan Roumie didn't just trend on social media, it exploded across every platform. Simultaneously, Terminator terminated and Jonathan knockout were trending within the first hour. With millions of posts flooding in from around the globe, the video of Dwayne's face when Jonathan delivered his final line, that moment of complete shock and realization, became an instant meme. But unlike most political memes designed to mock or demean, this one seemed to capture something deeper, the exact moment when privilege encounters perspective and doesn't know how to respond. GIF creators worked overtime, capturing the precise second when Dwayne's confident expression crumbled into bewildered silence. A video compilation of Dwayne's confident opening statements, followed by his speechless reaction, garnered over 2 million views in the first 3 hours. Comment sections across platforms were filled with people sharing their own stories about facing barriers that successful people often couldn't see or understand. The conversation had sparked something much larger than just political debate. It had opened a national dialogue about hidden advantages and unseen obstacles. International news outlets picked up the story within hours. European media focused on Dwayne's immigrant background and how American success stories were being redefined. Asian networks highlighted the generational and cultural clash. African media emphasized Jonathan Roumie's points about systemic barriers. The confrontation had become a global conversation about opportunity, privilege, and the complexity of the American dream. Major news networks scrambled to cover the story, but they struggled with how to frame it. This wasn't your typical political takedown where someone was caught in a lie or exposed for corruption. This was something much more complex and nuanced. Progressive outlets hailed Jonathan Roumie as a hero who had finally found a way to explain systemic inequality in terms that couldn't be dismissed. Conservative commentators found themselves in an awkward position. They couldn't attack Dwayne without undermining their own narrative, but they also couldn't easily defend his position after what had just happened. One prominent political analyst was quoted saying, "I've been covering politics for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." It wasn't about gotcha moments or talking points. It was about fundamental differences in lived experience. And somehow Jonathan Roumie found a way to make that real for everyone watching. Behind the scenes, Dwayne's advisors and public relations team were in crisis mode. How do you spin a moment where your client was left completely speechless? How do you recover from what appeared to be a fundamental challenge to your entire worldview? Initial attempts to downplay the exchange fell flat. A statement released by Dwayne's team saying he looked forward to continuing the conversation was widely mocked online. People weren't interested in political spin. They had witnessed something authentic, and they could tell the difference. Dwayne himself remained notably quiet in the immediate aftermath. For a man who had built his career on bold statements and confident proclamations, his silence spoke volumes. For Dwayne Johnson, the moment represented a career-defining realization, but he handled it with characteristic grace. In interviews following the confrontation, he didn't gloat or attack Jonathan Roumie personally. Instead, he used the attention to further explain the points he had made. This was never about Dwayne Johnson as a person, he said in a television interview the next day. This was about helping people understand that the American dream exists, but the path to it isn't the same for everyone. When we acknowledge that, we can work together to make it more accessible. Dwayne Johnson's favorability ratings among fans skyrocketed. But more importantly, he began receiving support from unexpected quarters. Moderate Republicans and independents who had never heard of him before were suddenly paying attention to his message. The confrontation sent shockwaves through political circles in both parties. Democratic leaders saw in Jonathan Roumie a new voice who could articulate complex issues of equality and justice in ways that resonated with broader audiences. His ability to challenge someone as prominent as Dwayne Johnson without resorting to personal attacks or typical political rhetoric was seen as exactly the kind of communication style the party needed. Republican strategists, meanwhile, were forced to grapple with uncomfortable questions about their own messaging around success and merit. The traditional bootstrap narrative that Dwayne Johnson had been pushing suddenly seemed incomplete at best, tone-deaf at worst. He didn't just beat him in a debate, one Republican consultant admitted privately. He made his entire argument look like it was missing half the equation. But perhaps the most significant impact wasn't in political circles at all. It was in living rooms, offices, and dinner tables across America. The confrontation sparked millions of conversations about privilege, barriers, and different starting points in ways that abstract policy discussions never could. Parents used the moment to explain to their children why some people have advantages others don't. Teachers incorporated the exchange into discussions about American history and civil rights. Even corporate diversity training programs began using clips from the confrontation to illustrate concepts that had previously been difficult to communicate. One viral social media post captured the broader sentiment. I've been trying to explain privilege to my dad for years. 5 minutes of Jonathan Roumie did what I couldn't do in 5 years. Perhaps the most surprising development came weeks later, when Dwayne Johnson broke his silence in a thoughtful, lengthy social media post that shocked both his supporters and critics. I've been thinking a lot about what Congressman Roumie said, he wrote. I came to America and worked hard, and I'm proud of what I built. But he's right. I never had to worry about things that other people worry about every day. That doesn't make my success less real, but it does mean I need to think differently about other people's struggles. The Post went on to announce that Dwayne Johnson would be partnering with civil rights organizations to learn more about the barriers that different communities face. It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement that the conversation had fundamentally changed his perspective. Months after the confrontation, political scientists and communications experts were still analyzing what had made Jonathan Roumie's approach so effective. Unlike typical political attacks that often backfire or create defensive reactions, he had managed to challenge Dwayne Johnson's worldview while still respecting his achievements. He didn't tell him his success wasn't real, noted one professor of political communication. He helped him understand that his path to success wasn't the only path, and that some people face obstacles he never had to overcome. That's a much more powerful message than simply attacking someone's record. The exchange became required viewing in political science courses, communication programs, and leadership training seminars. It was studied not just for its political impact, but as an example of how to have difficult conversations about complex topics in ways that actually change minds rather than just scoring points. The confrontation between Dwayne Johnson and Jonathan Roumie represented something larger than just one moment between two political figures. It demonstrated that American audiences were hungry for substantive discussions about real issues delivered with intelligence and authenticity rather than sound bites and attack lines. Politicians across the political spectrum began trying to emulate Jonathan Roumie's approach, using personal stories and lived experiences to illustrate policy positions, speaking with passion, but without losing precision, challenging opponents' ideas without attacking their character. The success of this approach suggested that American political discourse might be evolving beyond the typical partisan shouting matches that had dominated for years. Voters seemed to respond positively to politicians who could explain complex issues in human terms and who could challenge each other's ideas without resorting to personal destruction. The impact of that one evening continued to spread in unexpected ways. Young people who had never paid attention to politics began following Jonathan Roumie's career. Established politicians began studying his communication style. Even international observers noted how he had managed to discuss issues of race and inequality in ways that educated rather than divided. Dwayne Johnson, for his part, became an unlikely advocate for examining privilege and barriers. His journey from confident challenger to speechless listener to thoughtful learner became its own powerful story about the possibility of growth and change, even for people who seemed set in their ways. The confrontation offered several key lessons that extended far beyond politics. First, it showed that effective communication about difficult topics requires understanding your audience and meeting them where they are, rather than simply attacking their position. Second, it demonstrated that personal stories and lived experiences can be more powerful than abstract arguments or statistics when trying to change minds. Third, it proved that it's possible to challenge someone's worldview while still respecting their humanity and achievements. Finally, it suggested that American audiences are ready for more sophisticated political discourse. They can handle complexity, nuance, and difficult truths when they are presented with skill and authenticity. In the end, the confrontation between Dwayne Johnson and Jonathan Roumie became more than just a viral moment or a political victory. It became a masterclass in communication, a lesson in empathy, and a demonstration of how real change happens, not through force or volume, but through truth delivered with precision and purpose. Dwayne Johnson had walked onto that stage as the people's champion, confident in his ability to overwhelm any opponent. He left as a student, humbled by an encounter with perspectives he had never considered. Jonathan Roumie had arrived as a rising political star. He departed as a voice for a new generation of leadership that could bridge divides while still fighting for justice. The moment when Dwayne stood frozen in shock became symbolic of a larger awakening, the recognition that the American story is far more complex than any one person's experience can capture, and that true leadership requires the humility to listen, learn, and grow. What did you think of this incredible showdown? Did Jonathan Roumie change your perspective on these issues the way he changed Dwayne Johnson's? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more explosive political moments that you won't see anywhere else. The next confrontation could be even more shocking than this one, and trust me, you won't want to miss it when it happens.